Hello. This is our entering the last quarter of the human geography reviews of all these videos that I am making. We are entering the economic, or what is considered the economic end of the human geography cycle with agriculture. So, this will be the agriculture video, and we'll be discussing everything about farming. So, here is the big things that you need to remember about agriculture. Remember your agricultural hearths. Where did we first domesticate various plants and animals? So you may want to take a look at that map that's in the text that talks about where did we originally domesticate wheat? Where did we domesticate the chicken? Where did we domesticate the cow? Where did we domesticate the potato? All this stuff. There's very often a question about where various species were originally domesticated and then how it diffuses from that point. So, get a pretty good handle on the various agricultural hearths. The big ones are going to be Mesopotamia, West Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and then Central America and South America, especially the Andes region, where a lot of our critters and our plant materials become domesticated things. Know the difference between subsistence and commercial agriculture. Subsistence is you are growing usually various crops and various animals to feed your family. That is where you get your food. You're not really growing it for the marketplace. You're growing it specifically because you want to feed your family. So that is subsistence agriculture or subsistence farming. Commercial agriculture is when you are growing something to sell in the market. That's how you're going to make money. And in many cases, with a commercial farm, you tend to focus on one thing because it's more economic to grow the one thing than trying to grow lots of little things. And so this is where you end up with a corn farm or a hog farm or something like that, to where, again, scale of economy here. You can make more money by concentrating on one thing, having the right one single set of tools or single set of machinery to make it all happen. Because again, you're going to take all this stuff to the marketplace and make your money that way. So the difference between, keep that in mind. Um, know your revolutions. There are nowadays four revolutions. When I was younger, it was five. Now one's gone. But your original agricultural revolution, when we began to do the cuttings of vines, when we figure out seed planting, what we normally think of is when we first start to farm. That is our first agricultural revolution. It is perhaps one of the biggest events that takes place in human history is us figuring out how to farm. The next revolution that we generally see is the Industrial Revolution. That's considered also the second agricultural revolution because at this point we start applying machinery to growing or raising animals. And in particular, we're looking at harvesters and planters and things like the cotton gin and things like that. Machines that used to do the work of a lot of farm labor can now be done by a machine faster and more efficiently. So that's our second agricultural revolution. Third agricultural revolution is the Green Revolution, and this is the introduction of chemical pesticides. This is chemical fertilizers, hybridized grains. This is Ernest Borlang and all his scientists down in Mexico coming up with these new ways of doing farming. And that they then experimented in India on a large scale, and it worked. And so now we are growing more food than we ever did because of these new technologies. That is the third industrial or agricultural revolution. The fourth, and then some will refer to it as the fourth, is the GMO or genetic revolution, that we are starting to genetically engineer our food, either animals or plants, to have the traits that we want. But instead of trying to do it through some sort of breeding process, we're now just going in straight to the DNA and swapping out the DNA to get the traits that we want. And we're not doing this just with plants, we're doing it with animals as well. So often they'll consider a fourth agricultural revolution as the one that we're in right now. where we are engineering our food to suit our purposes. Now, each one of these has a plus and a minus. If you look at the first agricultural revolution, we now have food and we know where it is. We don't have to go hunting around for it anymore. It also makes us fixed into one place, and it begins that sort of social stratification where some of us are going to grow the food and some of us are going to go do something else. And usually these something else's end up on top. So many of our ancestors ended up as peasants and serfs and whatnot, doing all the farm work. That second, the Industrial Revolution one, we began to see the growth of farms into commercial farming. This is where the Enclosure Act happens in England, where people are driven off the common land where they used to share to grow stuff or raise animals, and now it becomes somebody's property. Specifically, let's say a sheep farm or something. So some of us are driven off into the cities because we're driven off land. You're also starting to introduce machinery into the equation, which means eventually engines and stuff. We're starting to create pollution as far as agriculture goes. When you look at the Green Revolution, the third, you have things like chemical runoff. The pesticides kill the good and bad bugs. It also tends to kill the birds and frogs and everything else. And the idea that as these things enter the environment, they are contaminating the environment, both water, air, and soil. And so that there's big issues that come out of the green revolution, even though it allows us to produce far more food per square acre of land. So again, pluses and minuses. GMOs. We are now producing food that has proper combinations of nutrition that did not exist before because they didn't create those enzymes or whatever naturally. Well, now they do. We now have even more drought resistant plants or bug resistant plants that now produce their own pesticides naturally. And that is often seen as a good thing, but there are downsides, one of which is these laboratory created things are often patented, and therefore you have to buy it from the company that produced it. And that means that there's often a cost that you can't just carry over the seeds from the previous harvest and replant them. They've often been engineered for that not to work. You have to go buy more. And so that's considered a downside. Also, the idea that we become more and more monoculture, that we're as the farms get bigger, um, the number of farmers declines, and in those farms that are so big, the reason is they're focused on one thing: corn, soybeans, beets, whatever it is. They're only growing one thing, and there is a hazard anytime you do that of monoculture agriculture, that you're driving off often other species of plants that the animal world may have be dependent upon. Think about bees. If you don't have any flowering plants, your bee population isn't going to survive. And those are often necessary in the natural biomes. So there are downsides to all of this stuff, as well as the upsides. So just keep those in mind. Know the difference between intensive and extensive agriculture. Intensive means there's a lot of human energy involved, or there's a lot of capital investment involved in order to produce that crop or that particular animal. So think about wet rice farming. There's an awful lot of human investment in having to grow all those harvests of the rice and the paddies and stuff. If you were looking at gardening or vegetable production, it is also very, very intensive. You have to weed, you have to prune, you have to do all these things to keep these plants still going. So there's an awful lot of investment in all of this, mostly labor, but often think about it in terms of money as well, in order to grow these crops. If it's extensive, it usually means it has to take up a lot of space. And so think about cattle ranching would be considered extensive. You need a large space to feed your animals. And so you need a large area for them to be in, but you're probably not maintaining them on a day-to-day basis. So you don't have to be dealing with your cattle all the time. Therefore, it's considered low labor, but high area. That would be extensive agriculture. Um, Oftentimes, our grains are nowadays considered extensive, even though it's intensive capital investment because you have to buy the harvester and stuff. And those are expensive. But you're over such a huge area that often that cost per acre is fairly low. And again, your labor is very, very low. You've got one farmer and a harvester that is harvesting 10,000 acres of corn. So there's not a whole lot of people involved at all. So keep that in mind, the difference between the two. Think about von Thunen. Don't forget von Thunen. He's too useful. And the rings of agriculture. You have the city in the middle, the intensive agriculture like dairy farming and egg and chicken production, gardening for your vegetables and stuff. That's close by. The land costs are high, and the investment in labor is very high. But these are sorts of things that will make more money in the marketplace because they're so fragile and do not survive for a very long time. Think about milk, for instance. And so you can make money doing these things closer to the city, even though the land costs are higher. Further you go out, that's where you're going to eventually, in the modern world, hit your grain production. And you can have that because the land costs are lower and the grains are more easily transportable than, let's say, eggs. And so, even though you're not going to make as much money because you can move further out, land costs are lower, and you can still make money doing it. On the very fringe, you have your cattle and sheep ranching, whatever animals they are. In the old world, when it came time to turn them into hamburgers, you just marched them into the city, and that's where the slaughterhouse was. You had no transportation costs, and the land was cheap. That would be your extensive agriculture because you needed a lot of area for those sheep or cows or goats or whatever it was you were raising. But the land's cheap and it's not considered labor intensive. So remember what the rings were. You know, I know I skipped the timber part because in the old model, that's where you had to harvest your timber to heat your house and stuff. In the modern world, that is often taken up with specialty crops or luxury crops like coffee or tea or something that is maybe not a necessity as far as a crop goes, but the people in the city still like having it. So you would grow it out in that area. Usually something that you can transport pretty easy as well, just in case you ever wanted to know why. Know what agribusinesses are? Agribusinesses are these large companies that produce our food and often process it and market it to us. So, General Mills owns an awful lot of farms out there that produce corn or wheat or whatever. They own the land. They have these farmers growing this stuff. They will then transport it to some place to process it into, let's say, breakfast cereal. So they have a factory there that turns the corn into corn flakes or Wheatie Puffs or whatever. And then that factory sends it into the food commodity chain to where it's going to eventually end up on the shelf of your local Kroger's or HEB, and you take it home and put it in a bowl. That is that whole commodity chain of food production that from the farm to your breakfast table, that there is probably a company that controlled most of that production all the way down to maybe even the grocery store that sold it to you. They might own that too. So that is agribusiness. The big ones, ConAgra, General Mills, things like that. These are big companies involved in the food production business. Think about shifting cultivation. This is something that we see in subsistence agriculture, especially in the tropics, where farmers have to move their field every few years because the soil has been depleted. So they have to start all over again by clearing a new swidden area. That's where the trees are hauled off. Often this is done through slash and burn, where they will burn those trees, mix in the ash to try to put some mineral content back in the soil, and then have a subsistence farm there for a couple of years. Know that shifting cultivation and slash and burn are often connected. They're often connected ideas. They often happen in LDCs in the tropical world. So just keep that in mind. Know the different kinds of nomadism. You have pastoral nomadism, where you follow the animal herds. These are like the Mongolians of Western Mongolia that follow animal herds. You also have transhumance, which is when you lead the animal herds. So these are guys like goat herders, sheep herders, cowboys from the Old West, that they guided animal herds to a particular destination, either for new forage, new grass, or perhaps they're herding them onto someplace where they get turned into hamburgers or something. But that's that idea. So know your two different kinds of nomadism that you might have. Know the difference between livestock raising and dairy farming. Both involve cows, but they're handled differently. Livestock ranching, like cattle ranching, is specifically you're growing those animals so they can be steaks or hamburgers or whatever. In dairy farming, the animal is being raised for its dairy production, milk. And you see this more in northern countries because they have that cold winter, and so you have to keep your cows inside. And while they're inside, you might as well milk them. And so eventually, we decided that that was something that we would do year round. And so dairy farms, you're not they're growing the cows so much to eat as you want to collect their milk and you make that into dairy products. And there's lots of different things you can do with dairy. You can make cheese, you can make yogurt, you can sell the milk itself, you can do all sorts of stuff with it. So know the difference between the two and that you might see them in different places. In more warm climates, you tend to see more cattle ranching. In cold climates, you tend to see more dairy farming, even though we're all dealing with cows again. Speaking of, the dairy might not even involve cows sometimes. More and more, we're seeing things like goat dairy, for instance, where they're raising goats, but raising the goats for the milk. Rather than making them into cabrito or something like that. So that is something that you might see if there's a question in reference to dairy farming. They may be talking about goats and stuff too. You never know. Truck farming is the idea of growing crops to sell in the marketplace. And it's an old term. So think about like medieval marketplaces where I would bring in fruits and vegetables to sell into the city. Nowadays, that's usually associated with things like farmers markets. And often this is oriented towards organic food production. That the folks that set up booths as truck farmers in these farmers markets are marketing their stuff as being more healthy, more organic. We're not using pesticides, we're only using organic soils, blah, 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 blah. And so this is a new movement in food that we've seen over the last couple of decades. So if you see anything to do with truck farming, know that it probably has something to do with farmers markets and trying to bring high quality fruits, vegetables, meats to an urban market in these farmers markets that's set up. Um, Tillage and non-tillage. If you are using tillage, that means that you are using plows, and you're that image that you have of a farm with all the rows of plants and stuff. That is tillage, and this has to do with crop rotation as well. That because when we plow the land, it often loses nutrients over time. It tends to dry out. We have to do things like irrigate it, and we have to rotate the crops that are in it. So when we're doing non-tillage stuff, we are not doing it in rows. We're doing it in a much more natural setting of growing our food. So keep that in mind. Um, Remember the Columbian Exchange and exactly what it is. When we look at the Columbian Exchange, this is after the discovery of the Americas, and we see a big switch or sharing of species across the Atlantic. So the stuff that they were farming in the Americas and the stuff that they were farming in Asia, Europe, and Africa, we see those species cross and are now will appear in both sides. And this is a big deal because it increased the quantity of food that we could grow as well as the variety of food that we can grow. Europeans suddenly had potatoes, for instance. Latin America suddenly had chickens. And so, with these new varieties of foods, we as humans, populations went up, we got bigger, we got healthier. Because we had a wider variety of foods to choose from. So remember the Columbian Exchange, the Columbian Exchange of species, particularly of animals and plants. so that we can eat more stuff. Let's see what else. What else should we talk about? I'm getting tired. In case you hadn't figured that part out. I think we've actually covered most of it. The one thing might be to go back and connect agriculture to things like carrying capacity, overpopulation, because one of the things that especially people like Thomas Malthus was talking about was food production. And our food production wasn't keeping up with the population growth. And he saw a time where we would go beyond the planet's ability to support a human population. We would go above that carrying capacity, and we would be overpopulated, and people would start starving to death. Now, so connect that to agriculture again. Food security is another issue. We may have the food, but do people have access to the food? And so, if you're dealing with areas that are going through drought, for instance, they may not have a local supply of food to support that population anymore. They're going to have to get it from somewhere else. And if they don't have the money, or if war is going on, maybe that's something that can't happen. So, you suddenly have famines, you suddenly have people starving to death, and think of the consequences of that. Another problem would be things like food deserts. That in the cities, you may have whole areas that don't have access to nutritious food, that all they have access to is Taco Bell, and that's barely food, much less nutritious food. And so, if all you have access to is low quality, high carb, high calorie, garbage foods like potato chips and stuff like that, you're going to have some health consequences to that. You don't have access to fresh vegetables, for instance, because there's no grocery stores, because grocery stores won't set up in poor areas of cities. And so think about areas that are ghettos, areas of poor folk in the cities that may be subject to being in a food desert where they don't have access to decent food, and how there are ways to get around that. For instance, food trucks could come in that have groceries. Think about the ugly food movement, where we will make sure that even these foods that the grocery stores are turning down but are perfectly good to eat, we can get those to these folks and sell them for very little, if anything at all. And they're having access to more natural, perhaps even organic, but definitely more nutritious food than what you might get at Burger King, let's say. Think about the impact of agriculture, especially that third agricultural impact. Think about what happens when you, let's say, raise cattle or goat on an area, and they strip out all the vegetation, because that's sometimes what they do. You may be looking at desertification, where those animals clear out all the vegetable matter that's there, and then suddenly your arable land begins to dry out, and it turns into desert. Same thing can happen in slash and burn agriculture, that the soil is so poor, nothing grows in it anymore, and it becomes desert. So think about the process of desertification as maybe something that happens because of the presence of agriculture. Um, and that's probably enough. Those are the big ideas that really came out of agriculture. You're probably going to want to know your agricultural zones, where we grow food today, like where wet rice is produced, where your major wheat growing areas, where do we raise cattle, stuff like that. So that would be more looking at a map and just kind of seeing where these things are taking place around the world. But that should pretty much cover it. I hope you will look over that chapter anyway, just to pick up on the terminology and stuff that I might not have hit. And I will see you for our next installment, which is development and industry.